The rain began falling long before the funeral started. Dark clouds hung over the cemetery like a heavy blanket, matching the grief that weighed on everyone's hearts. Hundreds of people stood beneath black umbrellas, their faces solemn as they gathered to say goodbye to Ethan Hayes, a billionaire entrepreneur, respected philanthropist, and beloved father. To the world, Ethan Hayes was a success story. He had built a business empire from nothing, creating thousands of jobs and transforming entire communities through his investments. Newspapers called him a visionary. Business magazines described him as one of the most influential entrepreneurs of his generation. But to me, standing beside his polished mahogany casket, he wasn't a billionaire. He was simply Dad. The pastor's voice echoed softly through the rain as he spoke about Dad's life, his generosity, and the countless people he had helped. I barely heard any of it. My mind was trapped in memories. I remembered the nights Dad stayed awake helping me with school projects despite exhausting workdays. I remembered family vacations where he left his phone behind so he could spend time with us. I remembered his laugh, deep, genuine, impossible to forget. Most of all, I remembered his final days. Cancer had taken him far too quickly. 6 months earlier, he had still been leading board meetings and discussing future projects. Then came the diagnosis. Despite every treatment available, the disease spread aggressively. Even as his health declined, Dad remained calm. There were moments when I caught him staring quietly through hospital windows, lost in thought. Looking back, I realize he wasn't afraid of dying. He was worried about what would happen after he was gone. At the time, I didn't understand why. After the funeral service ended, guests approached one by one to offer condolences. Politicians, business leaders, employees, and lifelong friends shared stories about the impact Dad had made on their lives. Among them stood my grandparents, Richard and Evelyn Hayes. They cried loudly throughout the ceremony. Anyone watching would have believed they were devastated parents mourning their son. My grandmother clutched a handkerchief to her face, while my grandfather accepted sympathy from guests with practiced sadness. I felt sorry for them. No parent should have to bury a child. At least that's what I thought then. The weeks following the funeral were a blur of grief and legal paperwork. Estate attorneys met with family members to discuss Dad's will, trusts, and charitable plans. Everything seemed straightforward. Then 3 days after we buried him, my phone rang. It was one of Dad's attorneys. His voice sounded tense. "Have you seen the news?" My stomach tightened. "No, why?" There was a long pause. Then he said words I would never forget. "Your grandparents have filed a lawsuit against the estate." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. "What? They're seeking $92 million. I thought I had misheard him. $92 million. From their own son's estate. The attorney explained that Richard and Evelyn claimed Ethan had promised them ownership stakes in various properties and business assets. According to the lawsuit, they alleged he had unfairly excluded them from portions of his fortune. The accusations spread like wildfire. Within hours, television networks covered the story. News headlines portrayed my grandparents as heartbroken elderly parents fighting for what they deserved. Reporters interviewed legal experts who speculated that the estate could face a lengthy and costly battle. Public sympathy immediately shifted toward them. Social media filled with comments criticizing Dad. People who had never met him accused him of abandoning his family. Each headline felt like another blow. I sat alone in Dad's office that evening, staring at photographs lining the shelves. The same parents now demanding $92 million had stood beside his grave less than a month earlier, pretending to mourn. The betrayal felt impossible to comprehend. Yet as I sat there in silence, another memory slowly surfaced. 6 months before his death, Dad had called me into this very office. He had been unusually serious. He spoke about trust, about greed, about people who reveal their true character when money becomes involved. At the time, I assumed he was sharing general life advice. Now, I wondered if he had been preparing me for something. Because hidden among those memories was one sentence that suddenly sent a chill down my spine. A sentence about a special clause in his estate plan. A clause he said would only matter if someone betrayed him after he was gone. And deep down, I had a feeling my grandparents had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The lawsuit dominated headlines for weeks. Every news channel seemed eager to tell the same story. Two grieving elderly parents seeking justice against the estate of their late billionaire son. Reporters described Richard and Evelyn Hayes as victims who had been unfairly denied their rightful share of Ethan Hayes's fortune. Watching those interviews made my blood boil. The public saw tears, I saw manipulation. The version of my grandparents being shown to the world was carefully crafted, polished, and incomplete. They knew exactly how to appear sympathetic. They knew how to make people believe they were loving parents who had sacrificed everything for their son. But I knew another version of the story, a version that few people had ever seen. One evening, unable to tolerate another misleading news report, I drove to Dad's house. The place felt empty without him. His favorite chair sat untouched in the living room, and his reading glasses still rested on the desk in his office. I found myself standing in front of a large cabinet filled with documents and photo albums. As I flipped through old family pictures, memories began flooding back. My grandparents hadn't always been proud of Ethan Hayes. In fact, there was a time when they were convinced he would never succeed. Dad rarely talked about his early struggles, but whenever he did, the stories were surprisingly painful. After graduating from college, he had decided to start his own company instead of taking a stable corporate job. He believed in his idea so strongly that he invested nearly everything he owned into the business. The company struggled immediately. For years he worked 18-hour days while living in a tiny apartment. There were months when he could barely afford groceries. That was when he needed support the most. Instead, he received criticism. According to Dad, his parents constantly questioned his decisions. They told him entrepreneurship was a foolish dream and urged him to give up. Family gatherings often turned into lectures about responsibility and failure. When Dad approached relatives looking for small investments to keep the company alive, my grandparents actively discouraged them. They told family members he was wasting money. They warned everyone not to trust his business plans. Several relatives later admitted they had refused to help solely because Richard and Evelyn convinced them the company would collapse. Dad never forgot that, but he also never allowed bitterness to consume him. Against all odds, the company survived. Then it grew and grew and grew. Within 15 years, Ethan Hayes became one of the wealthiest businessmen in the country. That was when everything changed. Suddenly, the same parents who had doubted him wanted to be involved in every aspect of his life. They attended events they once ignored. They proudly spoke about his achievements. They told anyone willing to listen how much they had always believed in him. The transformation was remarkable and suspicious. At first, Dad welcomed them back. He genuinely hoped success had repaired old wounds. Instead, it created new ones. As his fortune expanded, so did their expectations. Every visit seemed to involve money. A larger house, a luxury vehicle, another investment opportunity, another expensive gift, another financial favor. Dad rarely said no. He purchased a beautiful home for them. He paid for private medical care. He funded vacations, renovations, and countless other expenses. Most people would have considered themselves incredibly fortunate. Yet nothing ever seemed enough. The more he gave, the more they demanded. A few months before his death, Dad finally showed me something he had never shared before. We were sitting in his office late at night. Without saying much, he opened a folder and handed it to me. Inside were years of emails and letters. As I read them, my stomach turned. Some messages contained demands for money. Others accused him of selfishness whenever he refused a request. A few even threatened legal action if he didn't transfer certain properties into their names. I couldn't believe what I was reading. These weren't conversations between loving parents and their son. They looked more like negotiations between creditors and a target. Dad watched quietly as I turned each page. Finally, I looked up. "Why didn't you tell anyone about this?" He smiled sadly. "Because people see what they want to see." I asked him why he continued helping them despite everything. His answer stayed with me. "Because I wanted to be better than the hurt they caused." Then his expression became serious. But kindness doesn't mean blindness. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now, with a $92 million lawsuit hanging over his estate, his words carried a completely different meaning. Because Dad had seen this betrayal coming long before anyone else, and he had quietly prepared for it. The more I thought about my father's final months, the more certain I became that he had anticipated exactly what was happening. The lawsuit wasn't surprising him. It couldn't, because 6 months before his death, Ethan Hayes had done something that seemed routine at the time, but now appeared incredibly important. He had completely rewritten his estate plan. I remembered the day clearly. Dad had invited me to lunch after one of his meetings with his legal team. His health had already begun declining, though he still carried himself with the confidence that had built a billion-dollar empire. We sat at a quiet restaurant overlooking the river. For most of the meal, we talked about ordinary things, family, business, and future plans. Then the conversation shifted. "I met with my attorneys this morning," he said. I nodded casually. That wasn't unusual. Successful people updated legal documents all the time, but there was something different about the way he said it. His voice carried a seriousness that immediately caught my attention. "There's a lot that needs to be organized," he continued. "Not because I'm expecting the worst tomorrow, but because life doesn't always give us the time we expect. I remember feeling uncomfortable. Neither of us liked discussing death. Yet Dad remained calm. He wasn't afraid. If anything, he seemed determined. Over the next several weeks, he spent countless hours reviewing documents, signing paperwork, and meeting with financial advisors. His attorneys later told me the estate plan became one of the most detailed they had ever prepared. Every property, every investment, every charitable donation, every inheritance, nothing was left to chance. At the time, I assumed he simply wanted to make things easier for the family after he was gone. What I didn't know was that one specific section of those documents received far more attention than all the others. A section Dad personally insisted on drafting. Several months later, shortly before his death, he finally explained it to me. We were sitting in his home office late one evening. The house was quiet. The only sound came from rain tapping softly against the windows. Dad leaned back in his chair and stared at a framed photograph of our family. Then he said something unexpected. "Success teaches you a strange lesson." I looked at him. "What lesson?" He smiled faintly. "You learn who loves you when you have nothing, and you learn who loves your money when you have everything." I didn't know how to respond. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he opened a folder on his desk. Inside were copies of estate documents covered in notes and signatures. He pointed to a specific page. "This is what my lawyers call a no-contest clause." I had never heard the term before. Dad explained that the clause would discourage anyone from challenging his estate after his death. If a beneficiary attempted to sue for more money than they had been given, they would automatically lose whatever inheritance they were already entitled to receive. It sounded harsh, but after everything I had learned about the pressure and demands he faced, it also made sense. Still, Dad wasn't finished. He tapped another paragraph farther down the page. "This part is my addition." I leaned closer. The wording was complex, but the meaning was clear. If any claimant knowingly filed false or misleading allegations against the estate, an additional provision would activate. Any assets they forfeited would not return to the estate. Instead, they would be transferred directly into a charitable foundation supporting young entrepreneurs. People exactly like the younger version of Ethan Hayes. I looked up at him. "Why do that?" His answer came instantly. "Because I don't want greed rewarded." He paused before continuing. "If someone genuinely deserves something, they'll receive it. But if someone tries to profit from lies after I'm gone, I'd rather that money help people chasing dreams." The conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. This wasn't revenge. It was principle, a way to ensure that dishonesty created opportunity for others instead of profit for the dishonest. At the time, the clause seemed like a precaution that would never be used. After all, who would challenge a carefully planned estate? Who would risk losing everything, now sitting in the middle of a $92 million legal battle? I finally understood. Dad had never been naive. He had seen warning signs years earlier. He had recognized patterns of behavior that others ignored. And while the world believed my grandparents held the upper hand, hidden deep inside hundreds of pages of legal documents was a safeguard they knew nothing about. A safeguard waiting patiently for the right moment. The lawsuit had triggered it. The process was already underway. My grandparents thought they were fighting for a fortune. They believed they were about to take control of assets worth millions. What they didn't realize was that every day they continued their case, they moved closer to activating the very clause that could destroy everything they hoped to gain. And soon, the entire world would discover what my father had planned. By the time the lawsuit reached the courtroom, public opinion had turned completely against my father's estate. For months, news networks had repeated the same narrative. Richard and Evelyn Hayes were portrayed as elderly parents fighting for justice. Commentators questioned why a billionaire son would allegedly leave his own parents with less than they deserved. Online discussions painted Ethan Hayes as a cold businessman who had forgotten the people who raised him. The accusations spread faster than the facts. Meanwhile, the estate's legal team remained unusually quiet. They refused to engage in public arguments. They gave no emotional interviews. They simply prepared. That silence frustrated my grandparents' attorneys, who appeared increasingly confident with every passing week. They spoke to reporters as if victory was inevitable. Watching it unfold felt surreal. The people who had spent years demanding more from my father were now presenting themselves as victims of his success. Yet through it all, Dad's attorneys never seemed worried. They knew something the other side didn't. And eventually, the day arrived when they would reveal it. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the gallery seats. Legal analysts attended in person. Even people with no connection to the family wanted to witness the battle over a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I sat quietly behind the estate's legal team. Across the room, my grandparents appeared confident. For the first time since Dad's funeral, I studied them carefully. They didn't look heartbroken. They looked hopeful, hopeful for a payday. The proceedings began with standard arguments. Their attorneys repeated claims that Ethan Hayes had made promises regarding properties, investments, and future ownership interests. They argued that verbal commitments had been ignored, that assets had been unfairly distributed, that justice required compensation. Then it was the estate's turn. One of Dad's senior attorneys stood and calmly approached the judge. Without drama or emotion, he presented a thick collection of documents. The courtroom grew silent. For nearly an hour, he walked through every relevant section of my father's estate plan. Every signature, every witness statement, every amendment, everything had been executed perfectly. Then he reached the clause. The room seemed to hold its breath. The attorney explained the no contest provision and its consequences. He outlined how any beneficiary who challenged the estate would immediately forfeit designated benefits. Several reporters began taking notes frantically, but the real shock came moments later. The attorney introduced evidence showing that multiple claims made in the lawsuit directly contradicted documents my grandparents had personally signed years earlier. Property agreements, financial acknowledgments, written confirmations. The evidence was overwhelming. The promises they claimed existed had either never existed at all, or had already been resolved through legally binding agreements. As document after document appeared on courtroom screens, I watched my grandparents' confidence disappear. Their attorneys began whispering urgently among themselves. The judge's expression hardened. Suddenly, the case that once looked powerful began collapsing in real time. Weeks later, the court delivered its decision. The lawsuit was dismissed. The claims failed. The evidence simply didn't support their allegations. But losing the case wasn't the worst part. The worst part came afterward. The clause activated automatically. Everything my father had planned happened exactly as intended. The trust established for my grandparents' future care was terminated. Several properties designated for transfer were removed from their inheritance package. Millions of dollars in financial benefits disappeared overnight. The amount they lost far exceeded anything they could have gained through the lawsuit. And according to the secondary provision Dad had personally written, those forfeited assets didn't return to the estate. Instead, they were redirected. Months later, those funds became the foundation of a national entrepreneurship program. Young dreamers received business grants, small startups gained funding. Students from struggling backgrounds received scholarships and mentorship opportunities. Thousands of lives were transformed. The irony was impossible to ignore. My grandparents had pursued money out of greed. In the end, their greed financed opportunities for strangers across the country. The media quickly changed its tone. The narrative of victimhood vanished as court records became public. People finally saw the evidence that had remained hidden for years. The truth emerged, not through revenge, not through anger, but through facts. A year after the lawsuit ended, I attended the opening ceremony for the Ethan Hayes Entrepreneur Foundation. A large bronze plaque stood near the entrance. Engraved beneath Dad's name was a quote he often repeated: "Character is revealed when profit becomes possible." As hundreds of young entrepreneurs filled the room, sharing dreams of businesses they hoped to build, I found myself smiling for the first time since his death. My father had understood something important. Real revenge isn't always about hurting those who betray you. Sometimes it's about making sure their betrayal accomplishes the exact opposite of what they intended. Richard and Evelyn Hayes had chased a fortune. Instead, they created a legacy, and from somewhere beyond the grave, Ethan Hayes had won the final battle with a single clause they never saw coming.